Donald Trump today defying the advice of his top military advisors and ordering a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, creating a power vacuum likely to be filled by Russia, among others. In a part of the world that is decidedly zero-sum, today's decision will cheer ISIS, Moscow, and Iran. It's a fact not lost on the Pentagon, which lobbied the president as late as Wednesday not to take today's action. From the New York Times, quote, in a series of meetings and conference calls over the past several days, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and other senior national security officials have tried to dissuade Mr. Trump from a wholesale troop withdrawal, arguing that the significant national security policy shift would essentially cede foreign influence in Syria to Russia and Iran at a time when American policy calls for challenging both countries. The Times adds, quote, Pentagon officials who had sought to talk the president out of the decision as late as Wednesday morning argued that such a move would betray Kurdish allies who have fought alongside American troops in Syria and who could find themselves under attack in a military offensive. And if you need any more proof that Trump made today's decision unilaterally and in opposition to his own military, the Washington Post writes this, quote, the decision signals a halt to an extended American ground campaign against the Islamic State and upends plans across the U.S. government articulated by senior officials as recently as this week for an ongoing mission to stabilize areas once controlled by the militants. But Donald Trump disagreed. This morning he tweeted this, quote, we've defeated ISIS in Syria. My only reason for being there during the Trump presidency. The whiplash was best described by Josh Rogan, who writes in the Washington Post on a piece entitled Trump Undermines His Entire National Security Team. On Monday, the U.S. Special Representative for Syria engagement publicly pledged that the U.S. commitment to Syria would not waver. The very next day, Trump reportedly decided to rapidly withdraw all U.S. troops there. At least one Russia watcher says to look for Vladimir Putin to tout today's news in his year-end press conference tomorrow. A Russian government spokesperson has already praised the order, saying, quote, the U.S. decision could result in genuine real prospects for a political settlement in Syria. So to recap for everybody, Pentagon, not happy. Putin, so happy. Here to break down another extraordinary day of news, some of our favorite reporters and friends from the New York Times, Chief White House Correspondent Peter Baker. Also joining us, Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One, retired four-star General Barry McCaffrey, a former battlefield commander in the Persian Gulf, Ron Klain, he's former Chief of Staff to Vice Presidents Biden and Gore, and with us on set, Jason Johnson, Politics Editor for The Root. I have to start with you, General McCaffrey, your reaction.
Well, I think the most important assertion I'd put on the table is there is no national security process in the U.S. government. We ended up with Bolton and the State Department rep and the Pentagon, the chairman of the JCS and others had reassured the international community that we would not withdraw. And it's clearly good news for the Iranians, for Hezbollah, for the Russians, and most importantly for Assad, who will now see a chance to finish them off. It looks to me as if it was cooked up, essentially, one-on-one between Erdogan and Mr. Trump, in which he says, look, the Turks are buying a bunch of our military equipment, and he ceded the battlefield, this is speculation, to the Turks.
General, what do you make of all the background noise? I mean, just this week, the president's former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, had two of his former colleagues indicted for crimes around their business activities with the Turks. Mike Flynn himself was essentially planning what looked like a rendition of someone Erdogan wanted. And now the president seems to go against the advice he was given by Secretary Mattis, by his military advisors, and doesn't just go against their advice, pulls the rug out from under them. A lot of members of Congress and others saying they learned about this in the newspaper.
Well, there's also a lot of pushback now to Republicans in the Congress, which is encouraging to me. Look, the Mike Flynn thing is almost a separate issue. Poor Mike Flynn, I think, was particularly the whole notion of renditions, snatching somebody in the United States and possibly turning him over with such criminal, insane conduct. It's hard to imagine what was going on. And by the way, Obama had fired Flynn for being erratic while he was on active duty as a three-star in Defense Intelligence Agency. So I think Mike Flynn is probably going to end up behind bars and is a separate issue. But back to the issue at hand, I think the problem is we are running a global national security foreign policy strategies. And what we have right now, essentially, is the president in almost a sort of a rogue operation, fully within his constitutional authority, making impulsive, unilateral, and frequently bad judgments. That's the issue.
I wanted to ask you about that, General. We have seen the president go to war, really a hot war against the intelligence community, undermining and not accepting their assessment around Khashoggi, very famously now undermining and not accepting their assessment around Russia. He's been at war with the law enforcement agencies since day one. It seems with the planning or the desire to have a military parade, the decision to send troops to the border, and then this move today, that he's accelerated his conflict with the military. How is that going over inside the Pentagon?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for inside the Pentagon. I think basically, you ended up with the primary national security players, obviously, are the Pentagon, CIA, State Department, and Treasury. And they're very professional people. They're career people. They know exactly what they're doing. They have years of experience. And they're running into an operation in the White House in which the president really won't read their material, won't take complicated briefings, has no background, and yet will impulsively make a decision. It's hard to know where all this is going to go, but so far it's rebounding to our disadvantage in terms of keeping the American people safer. There's still a couple of thousand ISIS fighters in Syria, and our Kurdish allies, who we're now going to abandon. And by the way, that's another message to our allies to not trust us. It's just hard to understand what he was thinking, except placating the Turks and doing something positive for the Russians. And by the way, benefiting the Iranians and Hezbollah in the process also.
Kevin Barron, can you jump in here? And the general chooses his words very carefully, but there's something ringing in my ears. The impulsivity of the commander-in-chief, the impulsivity and absence of a strategy with American national security. Those are things that you usually hear on the campaign trail, not from someone who has already sort of arrived at the post of the commander-in-chief. Do those things disorient, scare, frighten, alarm, or are they ignored inside the Pentagon?
Well, they're dealt with. You're right. I mean, we're 2 years into the presidency and 2 national security advisors into the presidency. And we've already heard inside the Pentagon how they've adapted to the president. They expect him to make impulsive decisions. And when they do, they just try to be ready to field them. But I think we should try to look ahead to, after all this dust settles, what's really going to happen. Are all U.S. troops going to pull out of Syria? Already today we're hearing probably not. That's not what the Pentagon is trying to do. That's not what's been decided. That may have been the tweet this morning, but there was a background call at the White House, and they're saying, they're all saying the right, very cautious things, that there already was a plan. The president has wanted to pull people out. Some people think you could lower the troop levels a little in the north, and that would placate some of Turkey's concerns while still ensuring U.S. interests. But no one's talking about pulling troops where the real fighting is going on in southern Syria, in that middle Euphrates River Valley. But those troops down there and in the rest of the country are what's keeping the lid on ISIS and the ISIS that remains. Not just the active fighters, but the latent, the ones that are people afraid will come out of the woodwork all over in places like Raqqa, which is supposed to be a huge success story. It's the one area in the world where everything has gone right, meaning that the U.S. has used local forces to secure the area at a very low cost to the U.S., low cost to U.S. troops, with a great benefit. Women in charge of leading civil governance, democracy flourishing and ready to go if the U.S. community, the U.S. and international community will support it. If the president will support it, will provide the stability ops, will keep some troops in the area. So I think this is very similar to when he announced we're going to leave Syria in the spring when this happened before. When he said it, the Pentagon said, well, wait a minute, and it didn't really happen. I think we got to give it a day or two to see what the real pullout is going to be.
But can I just interrupt you? I mean, how ludicrous is that? Have we ever had a commander-in-chief who's essentially ignored? So he sent troops to the border. Lots of Republican senators and Democrats called it a stunt. He ordered a military parade. They humored him. They planned a parade, and then they pulled the plug. I mean, is he someone, is the Pentagon, I mean, you're basically describing a U.S. military that does not listen to the commander-in-chief. Is that what's going on?
Well, no, I don't think that they don't listen to him. I think that they try to prepare for the unexpected.
Transgender ban. He ordered a transgender ban. I mean, listen, to their credit, I'm cheered if you're telling me that the military doesn't listen to him. But I read a lot of quotes of a lot of senior Pentagon officials who were alarmed by the news, who had the rug pulled, who were testified or communicated as recently as yesterday that our commitment was solid. The president seems to have his foreign policy run through Moscow or Turkey or other countries. I mean, are they happy just ignoring him?
No, I think there's a little bit of having it both ways. The president will make these outlandish announcements that throw everybody into a fit and surprises folks. And then the professionals that General McCaffrey talked about come into the room and say, wait a minute, here's what we can do to accommodate what you're saying.
But they were in the room yesterday. They were in the room this morning, and they didn't prevail.
Well, we don't know that yet. We don't, as far as we know, we heard today Mattis has not signed an order to pull all the troops out, and the White House on their conference call saying that a troop withdrawal is, going to be happening, but we don't know that it's a full pullout yet. So I understand what you're saying. There's a lot of frustration that people wish there was a more traditional process to get to these decisions, especially for people like the Central Commander who has to, field phone calls from every chief of defense in the region, going, "Wait a minute, you guys said you were going to stay," but this is how it works. The president makes his statement, and then the Pentagon goes, all right, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, and we'll see if there actually is a full pullout from Syria. I seriously doubt there will be.
Peter Baker, I'm old enough to remember when national security agencies used to red team American adversaries, not the commander-in-chief. Tell me what you make of the fact that the common denominator, the first thing we checked when we saw this news was to see if there was any official reaction from Vladimir Putin's government, and sure enough, a lot more enthusiasm for today's decision from Vladimir Putin's government than the United States military, the United States Congress, or the United States allies. What do you make of, once again, a story with a punchline that runs through Moscow?
Yeah, I know. It's a great question. I mean, there are two aspects to this decision that need to be focused on, right? And we've been talking about them. General McCaffrey and Kevin have been talking about them. There's the substance of the decision and the process of the decision, right? The process clearly is a Donald Trump classic in which not everybody knows what's going on. They're being undercut from one day to the next, and we're not 100% sure if it will follow out the way Kevin has just described. The substance of it, though, is in keeping with what Donald Trump has said from the beginning. The truth is, as much as he might not like to admit it, he and President Obama share a general skepticism about the use of American force overseas, about the utility of America's commitment to these hotspots around the world. He criticized President Obama for being too slow in getting out of Iraq. He did say last spring that he was going to pull out of Syria, only backed off when Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, said, wait a second, that would destabilize everything. Don't do that at this point. And you're right. The Russians are more than happy to have us be pulling back. They have increased their presence in the Middle East in the last few years. The more we pull back, the more they feel like they have a free hand. But remember, what President Trump is doing is what he has said he would do, and what, in a lot of ways, a lot of the American people are kind of want him to do. Like, they don't really particularly want to be part of these Middle East adventures, even if there are consequences that the national security experts see for a pullout like this.
Jason, there's some pushback on Capitol Hill from Democrats and Republicans. Let's watch.
The decision to withdraw an American presence in Syria is a colossal, in my mind, mistake, a grave error that's going to have significant repercussions in the years and months to come.
In my view, ISIS is not defeated in Syria and Iraq. If you're tired of fighting radical Islam, I understand it. They're not tired of fighting you. And if you don't get that, you're making a huge mistake. If this decision is a withdrawal of all of our forces in Syria, now we're dramatically less safe. This is an Obama-like move.
No, because Obama didn't do that, Senator Graham. That's part of the issue. This is what really concerns me about this. And you sort of pointed this out earlier, Nicole, about our allies, right? If this announcement alone, even if the generals don't do what President Trump has asked for, every single refugee, because what's been happening is the U.S. troops have been allowing the refugee crisis of people fleeing into Europe to sort of slow down, because they see, okay, the Americans will protect us. They will stabilize things here. If they hear that we might pull out, there is a flood of refugees going back to France, going back to Germany, going back to England, which destabilizes things. Right. Yeah, leads to Belgium, leads to right-wing organizations getting more power, which helps Putin. All of this is not just stabbing in the back American foreign policy. It absolutely stabs in the back our our allies as well. And it's a humanitarian crisis created by a tweet.
Peter Baker, can you jump in on that? I mean, just the optics of doing yet another thing on Vladimir Putin's national security honey-do list for Donald Trump is terrible at a moment when people are debating openly in your newspaper and on our air whether or not a sitting president can or will be indicted.
Right. It's a really good question, and it comes on the same day, by the way. The Treasury Department is once again on these sanctions, imposing some new ones on some of the Russians for the election meddling. You see this sort of dichotomy inside the administration, and yet Oleg Deripaska, the Russian oligarch, is going to get some breaks. So it's a really messy kind of situation right now when it comes to the Russians. Are we standing up against them in places like the Middle East, in places like Ukraine, and in terms of the election meddling that continues to be of great concern, or are we, basically their collaborators, allies, partners in some of these things? And what you saw in Buenos Aires is the president really wants to sit down with Vladimir Putin. He was annoyed that he couldn't because of the Ukraine crisis in the Sea of Azov there, and he's looking for ways to get back together with President Putin if they can resolve some of these issues. But right now, this is a relationship that's fraught with difficulty, both politically, domestically, as well as internationally.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.